asked him for his reading this, for a little information to add to the introduction, and he told me that he and Mark have been known to shut down family conversations by discussing the virtues of the SD40-2 locomotive. But who among us doesn't appreciate the longer frame and the larger front and rear porches of the 40-2? It was brought out in 1972 when I was just 3. I mean, it's no Class 43, but I can see the appeal of that particular model.
Thank you for doing your research.
I assumed you were testing me with that. These two love and breathe trains in models, artifacts, and photography, and now they will gladly share that love with us. Please welcome David and Mark Zulkoskey.
There is something magnificent about trains. Trains of all shapes and sizes captivate people. Whether it be a tiny train set going around your Christmas tree, we can talk about that later, or the train that stops traffic, interrupts your journey, and yet you just can't help yourself but count the cars. For Mark and I, trains are glorious, and they've shaped our lives as I imagine they've shaped yours. Trains always... I thought I was a technical difficulty. So trains hold a special fascination for all people. The size, the power, and for passenger trains, the romance. It is an industry that at one time had an impact on all levels of our society. It connected communities for information, commerce, and as a means of moving people from one area to another. Prince Albert has a rich railway history that many people may not be aware of or even understand. And I'm reminded of Joni Mitchell's song, Big Yellow Taxi, and the line, "You don't know what you've got till it's gone." Yes. And in my part of the presentation, which will be from 1890 up until just the early 1990s, there's a lot that's gone. We would like to present to you a brief overview of the impact that railways have had and continue to have on this community. Railways have had a presence in this city going on for 135 years. It's a story of industry and the people that shaped our city by their labors. And in fact, my biggest fear was having a number of railway employees in the audience, and there are some railway employees in the audience, so I hope they will be kind to me. A great symbol of this history is the former Canadian National Railway roundhouse, which many of you drive by each day on 15th Street. It is large, it is functional, and it's unique to our city. As I said, my half of the presentation will begin with a short look at early stations in the city and conclude with a focus on the locomotive servicing facilities of Prince Albert in the late 1980s. My photography are in the albums which I've opened, and I invite you to have a look at them because I tried to chronicle every single thing that happened in the yard. I would teach at Carleton, and after school I'd zip down the 6th Avenue Viaduct, constantly checking the yard to see what was new. I'd see a flat car with a bulldozer on it. Down I would go and I'd take pictures, staying well clear of the track, safety first. But I would certainly try and record all the buildings as well. And there are a lot of buildings that are gone. Mark will be looking at the modern era beginning in the 1990s to the present day. My talk will be slightly in chronological order, but also be prepared as I'm going to jump back and forth through time. I'd like to thank Jerry McKelvey for inviting us to be part of this, and Fred Payton for his assistance in preparing my presentation. Are you ready? Mm-hmm. All aboard! With the arrival of the first train into Prince Albert, the Qu'Appelle, Long Lake, and Saskatchewan Railroad Steamboat Company, I love that, entered on the west side of our city, and the line began in 1883, and through startups and stops, as always is the case with railway building, it ultimately arrived here. And it was leased to the CPR until 1906, when it was acquired by the Canadian National Railway. Canadian Northern Railway. The Type 8 style station, which you will see in Rostering, is a classic, unique example of CPR stations on that line. And in fact, the original station for that rail line when it first came to PA looked very much like a CP station, because of course the CPR had leased it. And I have a book over there in the far table for CNR stations and the CPR stations. So when I talk about a classification, you can ask me for the number again and then have a look at it. So a similar, slightly similar Type 7 station for the CPR in Prince Albert was constructed in that area between 2nd and 3rd Avenues West and at 16th Street. It was a classic CPR structure. The CPR, however, had high freight rates to PA, and the previous means of transport, ox wagons, were used by one of our businessmen because he was not going to pay the freight rates from the railway. So he had an ox train, and it came from Capel all the way up to Prince Albert. Here's the important name, Cornelius Van Horn. You might remember that name. Charge the CPR was livid. And so what he did was he lowered the freight rates for CPR so that they would obtain that business. So I see a great opportunity to explore these early years. And if you know, I don't have any photographs. I had some, but I didn't have them put into the PowerPoint. And I think, here it is. Publicly, I'm going to say this. Perhaps there's a book to be written about this time period. So now let's jump into the PowerPoint images. Oh, I didn't start my timer. Okay, so this is not in 1890. This is in 1958. You'll notice the sign, Men at Work. The blue sign, when it's placed on the track, you cannot move that car because there could be men working underneath the train, men working on the train. So that sign can only be removed by the individual that put it in place. Okay, good. So here's the interesting thing. Diefenbaker is on that car. Diefenbaker is Prime Minister of Canada, and he's working on something, and he's in that car. You see, I'd like to dedicate my presentation today to Jack Hicks. J.V. Hicks was a very good friend of our family, and I inherited from him, before he died, his entire railway collection. And I have 304 black and white images, as well as the negatives, of all the shots that he took in about 1956 to 1959, and actually a couple in the 60s. Jack found this very amusing. He was a great fan of Diefenbaker, so he took a picture of the Men at Work sign. Here's the cool thing. I have that sign. 1958.
Is that the rail liner?
No, and we won't talk about rail liners just yet. And this is a side view of the car. And what I find so fascinating about this is all the paraphernalia around it, the old box cars, and that is the Diefenbaker car, well, the car that he used. Now, this is from the museum collection, and it was wonderful to go into the collection and have a look at these pictures. This is a Grand Trunk Pacific excursion train to the town of Waka. So I've already talked about the Capel, Long Lake, and Saskatchewan Railroad and Steamboat Company, but they leased their line to the CPR. The CPR left PA in 1906 when the Canadian Northern took over. The Grand Trunk Pacific Railway came up from the south, and roughly speaking, 1914, 1915, they built the bridge at St. Louis, and then entered the city from the south and came around, arced around the city, and then came in on the east side. The wonderful thing about this is an excursion train, as I said, to Waka. And the great thing about this is Jack Hicks went with Judge Doak's son to go to Waka for the day. And what you do is you leave the train in the morning, or you leave on the train in the morning, go swimming, and then take the train back. And so it was wonderful to hear the story from Jack about this, and then to find an actual picture of an excursion train in the museum. But this next picture is the gem of my collection. This is the Grand Trunk Pacific Station in Prince Albert. And that's Jack Hicks, standing on the platform. Now, this is not the station which was originally on 15th Street. This was on 1st Avenue East. And it was a stub station. So in that sense, the train came in around the east side and came in and ended at 1st Avenue East, where the station was located. And I have an old aerial photograph of PA in my collection. It's so cool because you can see it, and you can see it in relationship to the Canadian National. Sorry, I keep on saying Canadian Northern Station. I forget about. So, what do I want to tell you about this? Yep, okay, that's it. The next picture is a Grand Trunk Pacific snowplow. And if you know anything about Prince Albert, you know we get a fair bit of snow, and certainly in the rural areas where snow can blow in over the tracks and it's quite dangerous. And this plow would not only plow by the front, but there'd be underneath it something called a flanger, which goes between the rails and cleans out ice. Because what happens is when there's a buildup of snow, buildup of ice, it very easily can be to derail a train. And so this is also in my collection. Jack Hicks took this photograph as well. I don't think that's Jack, if that's a person, I don't think it is. But Jack was quite happy to have this photograph, to have taken it.
Is that?
But they use caterpillars to clean it.
Oh.
Because they can't go fast enough. It's 10-mile-an-hour tracks, so they get stuck all the time.
Exactly.
Oh.
And you
And
can't use those anymore. You gotta be doing it for 25, 30 miles an hour.
exactly.
Oh, okay.
And what they would literally do is keep routing it. And if you can imagine riding in the copula. And the cool thing is that when CN was leaving PA, we had, actually at that time we had 2 Jordan spreaders, which enabled to clear ditches, but they're also used for snow removal. And CN, this Canadian National, had 2 wedge plows as well. And I have the horns from one of those. Randy Clearwater, who was the train master, did you say at that time, said that I could have the horns. So they cut the horns off, and I took them out to my parents' farm, and most interestingly, of course they worked. We hooked them up to a big compressor and fired it up, and we could do it with and make a train sound, and people were all confused because it was near Red Deer Hill. And if you know anything about Red Deer Hill, the Grand Trunk Pacific line went through there from St. Louis, and so people thought, is the train back? So, no. And the other thing I forgot to say to you was that when the Grand Trunk Pacific came, I think that's the origin of the Ghost Light, the St. Louis Ghost Light, because of course that's their line. And it would make more sense to have a Ghost Light with an old steam engine, I think, than necessarily a diesel. Now this is where I learned a lot about PA. You feel like you know a lot about trains, and then you discover something else. So, this, as it says, is the East Prince Albert station, just south of 4th Street at, should be 11th Avenue East. I've been down there several times. My wife has said, stop going to Goshen and stop trying to find the location of the station. I mean, you can't really find it anymore because of the houses. But, if you drive down, I think it's 7th Street, if you drive down 7th Street, you will notice, if you really look, on the right-hand side, there's just a strange arrangement of trees, because the CPR used to go through there, cross 7th Street, and then you could still see the clearing where they would go through. And I have great memories of watching the CPR run on that line. This is a Canadian Northern station. And eventually, the CPR, which we'll talk about when they returned to PA, they took over, well, actually had running rights on that track. So this is a Canadian Northern station, and just beyond this station, the track split, and part of it went to the Prince Albert Forest Company on the far east side of PA, and the other part went to Hudson Bay Company buildings.
Dave, can I want to tap the button on there, please? Just so it says 8. Perfect, thank you.
All right. Wow. Technology. Yes, so yes, okay. This Canadian Northern station is very similar to a Grand Trunk Pacific Type F design. Now, this is a gem. And this is a Canadian Northern station as well, which eventually became the old Canadian National station. And in the next image I'm going to show you, you're going to see that it's expanded beyond. We've got the freight or express area here, and you're going to see that they actually expanded that, and then they built a freight house.
when I talked to you, you never answered. Is that the same as the one that's in Humboldt? Is that the
Very
same?
similar.
It's just
In
very
fact,
similar?
I invite you to look at my Canadian National Railway Stations book,
Yeah.
and it has a listing of every single
Oh,
one
okay.
on the prairies, and you can see
Because
the.
the design is very similar for the,
Yes,
for
yeah.
the train station.
Yes.
Okay, just, I'm like, he never answered my question when I asked.
No, I didn't.
So I just had to ask, sorry.
No, no worries. The one thing I'd like to say to you too about these stations is we always forget about the idea of freight and express freight. We talk a lot about couriers right now. Well, that was all really started with the railways in terms of priority freight. And when we get, well, I'll mention it right now. One of my stories that I remember growing up with the existing station that we have is that Fred Hildebrandt worked there in the freight area, and they'd get extra margarine. There'd be a packing case would be damaged, and so they would offer it to people at a reduced price. And our church got I don't know how many little things of margarine because there'd been an error, and so it had to be disposed of. I'm just going to back up just a bit here. So this is the same station. Yes. I love the architecture of this. And 15th Street is just on beyond. And it's interesting that they used a wooden boardwalk to get to the tracks. And the new station, the station that we have now, was built sort of in this area here. And I love the baggage wagons. And of course, there's some cream cans, and that was one of my big quests to find for my collection a baggage cart. And
We have one.
so do I. the first one that I found was from about 1895. It was a CPR one. It was in horrible shape, and I thought I don't have the time nor the energy to rebuild it. So the one that I have is very similar to this, and it came from, what's the community between Prince Albert and Shawbrook? Holby. And so there was an individual whose father had worked for the railway, and he was selling his collection. And so I bid and won baggage cart. Now, so there's the idea of freight, and then there's the idea of telegrams. Remember, the railway was a very important aspect of our community. And this is a social telegram, as it says, and it's best wishes to Jack and his wife on their wedding. You might know Marjorie Hicks, and you think, poor Jack, why did you marry her? But he did. And I say that because I know there's people in the audience going, oh boy, she was a character. And so I have all their wedding stuff. And I love it, much happiness. And I think, oh, Jack. So, as I said, the other aspect of railways was communication. Telegrams and ultimately teletype. I have one. I have a teletype machine in my basement. Lots of paper was used with them. The museum has a collection of telegraph keys, and they're originally from Jack Hicks. I inherited them. I gave them to Jamie Benson, who was very interested in telegraphy, and then he donated to the museum. And one of the things that I have from the station was the box that the sounder went in, so the guy could lean in and listen to it. And it's a really cool thing. So if you dig through your basements, you never know. You might find some old telegrams, but they were a wonderful way of communication prior to telephones. And to wish people like Jack, 1936. Yes, and they were married in the winter too, December 22nd. So this is an interesting shot of the yard, and I talk about Canadian Northern, but the Canadian Northern, Grand Trunk Pacific, and some other railways all became Canadian National Railways in 1923. And it was a problem of finances for these railways, and so the government nationalized created Canadian National. And actually it was the Grand Trunk Pacific, the Grand Trunk Railway, the Canadian Northern, and the National Transcontinental Railway, which went through Cochrane, Ontario. And the thing I like about this picture is that you get a really cool perspective of the yard, and you could see the caboose set out area, which was straight over there, and the old switch stands.
This
And-
track right here, this was a caboose track when I worked, right there.
And Tom,
Yeah,
I have that in one of my albums, but that's cool.
and where these two tracks came together, this one and this one, down here somewhere, that was the first switch you lined when you went to work, because that was it. You went to work, you lined that switch, and you came off the shop track. Sorry.
No, you're preaching to the choir. I love that though, like, in a good way, in a very good way. Feel free to jump in at any time.
Thank you.
No, that's fine. Don't worry. I was just staring because I thought you might say, and then David, you got that wrong. But no worries. Yes. So this picture, I wish I had a pointer, because this aerial photograph is very interesting to give a perspective of Canadian National Railway. And the one thing that I'll probably mention this a little bit later, but and one thing I didn't say to you was, so in 1906, the Canadian Northern took over the Coupelle Long Lake in Saskatchewan. In 1907, the Canadian Northern built a roundhouse here in PA. And thanks to Fred, I have a picture of, it's a 3-stall roundhouse, which they probably eventually expanded. It's not the roundhouse that we have here. And Tom, I think you told me this, it was just west of the existing roundhouse, I believe. The old one, the really old one.
Oh, I don't know that.
Okay,
No.
okay, because eventually, and I mentioned the roundhouse we have now. This is so fascinating because people love to talk about the roundhouse. I think it's a wonderful building. And Mark's going to talk about the modern use of it. But the roundhouse that we have now was built in 1955. Yeah, and here's the cool thing. It was the last one built in Canada. And when you talk about historical significance, it was built for steam and diesel locomotives. And then Mark will tell you what it's used for now. But the wonderful thing about it is, it was a 12-stall roundhouse, and it was so interesting. And Mark and I had been in it, and we had an orientation there, and it's absolutely most interesting, the idea of the turntable, which is controlled by compressed air. And I believe at one time there was a compressor in the roundhouse for it.
I think so.
Yeah. Because they used to take the feet off the locomotives, didn't they?
One interesting thing, if you don't mind, I'll just
No, go ahead.
say about the turntable used to turn, and the controls for it were inside where the car or the engine went on the tracks. And what happened one time was a fellow put a car on the track to turn it, and they would usually chug the car so it wouldn't move backwards. And this one time the car slipped back as the fellow was turning, and he was crushed between the car and the edge of that where he operated the turntable.
Right.
It was a very sad day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm looking at the time.
Dave, I think you do have a pointer up there. I think
That's too much technology for
Got
a
it.
retired teacher.
Did you mention too, like where the two elevators would be, so there's the brown weep hole, that would have been Grand Trunk Pacific line.
Yes, thank you, Mark. The Grand Trunk Pacific line was right there. And then eventually the
And then on the other
CPR.
side was the CPR.
This is a refueling area, and in one of my albums here, actually I've queued it up. It's for the diesel locomotives, and I do have some pictures of CP servicing. I have some pictures of these buildings, but not all of them. A lot of them are torn down when I started taking pictures in the 1980s. What I like about this is there is here in this area I think that's it. It's the shop service building for cars, the car shop area. And a lot of these tracks are now gone, but it's interesting. It's interesting because of the amount of work that was done here in PA, both on locomotives and cars, the car shop area.
What year was that photograph?
This photograph, I don't know.
Well, the UGG, the white elevator, would have been built in the mid-60s,
Okay.
so.
This is the CPR yard. And the CPR, well, I'll tell you this right now, it came in 1930. They returned to PA. And I read a very interesting Herald article about the excitement building in 1930 because the CPR was returning to PA. And they would return on trackage rights. And I have a copy of the official document. Got this from CN headquarters. This is the trackage rights for CPR to run on CN track to come into PA. So if you're interested in all the legal talk and whatnot, and what they're able to do and what happens in an accident, it's here. The interesting thing is, it came up from Lanigan, and there was a little, it wasn't even a community. There's the Fenton Bridge, and then just beyond that was CN Northway. And Northway was the junction where the CPR came up from Lanigan, then had trackage rights on PA, on CN, all the way into the city, and then just crossing 6th Avenue, there was CN tracks, which were former Grand Trunk Pacific, and then CP branched off into their yard here. You might remember True Mix Concrete. They were located just beside here. And then there was a CPR engine house here. I'm watching my time, so I'm gonna move a bit quicker. We're at 20 minutes for me, I think. Now, this is a real gem in my collection. The CNRA Hall, so the Canadian National Railway Association Hall, was torn down, and when they tore it down, that's when I learned it's okay to pick up paper off the ground. Because there were garbage bags full of papers, and they were blowing everywhere. And I looked at it, Mark was just a little guy, and I thought, I have to have this. And I'm so glad I did, because it was full of documents from the 30s and the 20s of listing every single item that they brought in to the shops. And one of the things interesting there, you'll notice, is Bon Ami Cleaner. And when the Hudson Bay Railway Station, VIA had been using it, and I was up there for a drama festival, and I looked in the windows, it was full of stuff. So I contacted VIA, and VIA said, "Did you want to buy the station?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Well, we're tearing it down, or we're going to sell it." But I said, "Well, what's happening to the contents?" They said, "Do you want it?" Foolish thing. So we took my dad's big 3/4 ton truck, and we emptied the station. And it was so cool, because we're sitting there eating our lunch, and just across the tracks is a CN track gang building. These guys are eating their lunch, they're watching me. And then they get in their car and they come around and I thought, oh great, now we're in trouble. They said, "Are you management? You work for the railway?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Okay, because we went over on our lunch." And I said, "That's okay, because I'm taking the station." They said, "Oh, have fun." How do I relate that to Bon Ami? Well, I wish I'd grabbed it, because in the freight house area, there were like 3 million containers in the CN logo, but it was Bon Ami Cleaner. And I really wish I'd taken one, but I was like, oh, that's chemical, I'm not touching that. Anyway, back to this. The other interesting item is Lily paper cups, and oh yes, toilet paper. So I thought you might find that amusing. But literally, on these papers, they have every single nut and bolt, and so forth. The stores part of the roundhouse had a concrete platform that box cars could be brought up to, or I even saw baggage cars, trucks could back up to it and unload material. Here we have a CNR switcher. I think it's a switcher. I don't think it's a 280. I think it's an 060, and some wheel sets outside the roundhouse. And one of the other gems of my collection is solid brass. Wow. And each locomotive had one. And this is 2585, and it was wrecked here in PA. It's a 280 consolidation class locomotive. And when they were first introduced, they were sort of dual freight, dual passenger, and then ultimately I think they were just used for freight. So Jack got that, he asked for it, and they said, yeah, you could take it, we have no use for it. And it's something this is the first time it's been out of my house in about 30 years. So enjoy it. Don't touch it. Now, one of the things about the roundhouse that I didn't say was it has breakaway walls, so that if a locomotive were to go in, if it were to go through the wall, it wouldn't destroy the building. It would just crumble that area. And Tom, you can correct me on this, but I understand the rail liner went right through the wall at one point.
I'm not sure of that, I don't
Okay.
know that.
Because someone said it went right through the wall and ended up on 15th Street. But then I don't know how it could ever have done that, because that's a that's a huge distance.
Yeah,
Yeah, you'd have to cross the rail.
yeah,
But,
I don't know.
okay. I can tell you that CN at one point had thought about tearing down the roundhouse. And the thing is, the demolition cost was so high that they didn't. And I think that's really wonderful. How my time? Okay, I'm getting close. And now people have asked me, are you going to talk about the skunk? And so I've done some research, and CN had, I love the spelling of diesel, where is it? Yeah, diesel spelled incorrectly. But unit, what is it, 18827 was a diesel car, but it wasn't the rail liner. And those early diesel cars were referred to as being the skunk. And so some people have said that the rail liner here that CN used was the skunk. I would argue that this is the original skunk, but that's for interpretation. I have a book over here on early diesel self-propelled passenger cars, and I invite you to look at it. I think I've got a card in, and you can see the history of the one from PA. It's mentioned there. When it was built, I think it was built in the late 1920s, and I think it probably was taken apart in the 1940s.
David, why did they call it the skunk?
Well, I'm assuming because of the smell. My dad went to PACI, and he talked about walking across the viaduct, and I think what he's referring, because he talked about the skunk as well, I think he's thinking about a rail liner. Because he said, as he walked across it, that would have been in late 40s, well, actually, that could have been the old one. You know, because the rail liners, I think, came in the 50s, mid-50s, and he used to talk about seeing it. And by the way, the Central Avenue Viaduct is a great place to hang out and shoot trains. I wouldn't go underneath anymore, but certainly standing up top, you get some great photographs.
Or as a kid, just standing up watching the turbo shoot into your face. No brain damage either, as far as we know, right?
No, not at all. Okay, I'm going to move a little bit quicker now. Once again, this is the CN servicing area for the roundhouse. We've got the stacks for the heating and boiler, you need compressed air and so forth. The water tower, classic metal water tower at this time period. Once again, a couple locomotives in the servicing area. And you will notice behind me, I have some old signs from our roundhouse and the car shop. And I don't have all the numbers, but it's quite incredible. 1,299 days in the car department without any injuries. But as Tom has said, the railway is an incredibly dangerous job too. You need to be alert and be very careful. And these are directly from our roundhouse. The wonderful thing is that when CN was leaving, I inquired about the contents of the roundhouse. They said, "Oh, I'll give you a tour." And then the guy said, "Do you have a screwdriver?" And I said, "No, I'll get you one." And he said, "These are yours." And so,
Except it did raise some issues when they rehabbed the roundhouse and they couldn't find any of the circuit panel
yeah, because I went over to the breaker panel, and there's a really cool recording of what each line did, so I just pulled them out. And then when they rewired the roundhouse, they didn't know which line did. And if you report me to Prince Albert City Police, I am now moving. But anyway, yeah, it was... Thanks, Mark. Don't talk about that.
You can tell about the time that we were actually trying to break into the roundhouse and an employee came up to you and said, "Do you work for the railway?" And you said no, and he said, "Here, let me grab you a crowbar," and he let you in.
Or the time there was a derailment near McDowell, and I went out there, I think you were with me.
Yeah, I was.
And you're just a little guy. And there are all these farmers getting scrap metal. So I 4x4'd across, and I saw this knuckle coupler, and I thought, oh, I really want one of those. I'm confessing. I stole the knuckle coupler. And I heaved it in the back of my vehicle. And then we actually had a break-in in our house. Thank God nothing was stolen. The police arrived with the dogs and everything. And this guy said, "Hey, where'd you get that coupler?" And I went, "Name drop." And I said, "Randy Clearwater." And he said, "Well, that's cool. I used to work for the railway." Boy, you're getting a true confession.
Randy's superintendent, is he?
Superintendent.
So,
Good thing it's not being recorded. Right?
And this is one of the internal signs of the roundhouse. You can see some of the areas of it. It's an absolutely fascinating building. And one of the things I will say is that I was in there talking to employees, and there's a beautiful old blackboard identifying the locomotive numbers and what was being done on them. And I said, "Do you guys want that?" And they said, "Well, we need a blackboard." I said, "That's okay, I teach at Carleton." So at Carleton, they had all these old blackboards they were throwing out. And I said, "Can I have one of those?" "Yeah, what are you going to do with it?" I said, "You don't need to know." So I went down and I delivered to the railway. They said, "There, take yours." I have it in my basement. So, how are we doing for time? Well, I've got less than a minute, so I'm going to move on. This is the CPR engine house, which a lot of you will remember on 6th Avenue. Sadly, I don't have anything from it, because this was, when this came down, I wasn't bold enough to ask. And the one thing I did get from it was one of the old little cars they pull behind the speeders, behind the jiggers. I have one of those. And it's made from packing crates in the 1920s, stamped CPR. And unfortunately, it deteriorated. There's great pictures of Mark as a little boy riding it on it. And I have the wheel sets. That's all that I have. All right, so I'm going to move a little bit quicker. Once again, CPR servicing. And CP ran on coal. And we've got a coaling tower and their sand tower. And CPR passenger. I think that's Fairman Brothers, way in the back far side. And the thing I like about this Canadian Pacific locomotive is you can see the viaduct in the background, Central Avenue viaduct. I believe this is well, it's a tank car. I think it's for auxiliary water for the steam engines. We have a lot of problems in Saskatchewan with the content of our water. It's very damaging on boilers. And so one of the things I'd like to get for my collection are the little tablets they used to put in the water. But no luck. And this is a lot of the CN locomotives eventually, well, they burned bunker C oil, which is the same kind of oil that would have been used in ships. And it's a heavy, viscous kind of oil. And this is the refueling area. I never witnessed this. This was long gone when I was a kid. But they're servicing one of the locomotives. A roundhouse? Yeah. Switcher 1200 RS, I think. Yeah. Oh Lord, it's like an SD 40-2 conversation.
That's the turntable right there.
Yes, absolutely. And Mark's going to talk. Mark will talk more about that. Okay, so it's all pretty close to me wrapping up now. This is the present day station. I think it was built in 1960, I think. Anyway, there's a rail liner. I brought a model of a rail liner, and the model that I bought is the actual, well, it's not the actual car, but it's the actual number of the rail liner that was used in Prince Albert, connected between Prince Albert, Saskatoon, and Regina. Oftentimes in Regina, they'd pick up another car as well. And this is what a lot of people refer to as being the skunk. But I'd argue the skunk was the old one, but
The telltales are kind of cool too.
yes, thank you, Mark. The telltales up top to catch if a man's on a car, top of a car, it lets them know there's a restricted clearance, which of course is the viaduct. And a number of times, you might have noticed over the years, well, maybe you have to drive over and watch, but there'll be boxcars stuck underneath the viaduct. And there's a number of times I would catch derailments because they put a car in where they shouldn't have, and it actually got wedged.
High cubes went through.
Yep, the high cube cars.
They ripped the roof right off them.
They did. This is the sand tower, and I have here, when the sand tower came down, I was able to get, I have two of these. These are the funnels that were made in the shops to put sand in the nose of the locomotive. Both steam engines and diesel locomotives use sand for traction. And one of the really cool things is, if you ever catch a train, carefully catch a train, going up the far hill by the penitentiary, you'll sometimes see them shooting sand to get traction if it's a heavy grain train. And so these were actually placed just over there. That container, CN at one time had some very early container for freight, and then eventually they were used for service buildings and yards and so forth. So they cut a door into that. And there was a little building on the other side of the cabooses, on the caboose tracks, and it was used for drying sand. Because of course it has to be dry so that they can put it in the sand tower. Okay, I'm going to move a bit quicker. RS-23, which was a locomotive built by the Montreal Locomotive Works. This is what CP used here in Prince Albert. I have absolutely no video footage of this. And it's one of those great things that you don't know what you've got till it's gone. And there were 40 of these built in Canada, and it was designed for light rail on the branch lines.
They'd run quartets of those through from Lanigan up to Prince Albert. Outside of Wetaskiwin, there's a railway museum there. One of the ones that operated in Prince Albert is there. I know that because I rode that the day I got married. So we got married at the museum, and rather than go with my wife in the rail liner, you know, this beautiful rail liner that had been decked out, I said to the guy, I want to ride up in the engine. I grew up with these engines here in PA. So my wife was a little bit miffed by that, but I mean, that's what happens when you get married at a railway museum.
And when Mark was just a little guy in his car seat, I would sit outside, and because you can get so close to the track there on 14th Street, we'd sit there and we'd watch the trains be switched, and yeah, wonderful memories. The GMD1, a gem, a wonderful locomotive. And at least I think so. We rode in it. Mark and I rode in this from the pulp mill to Prince Albert, and that was a wonderful experience to go across the rail bridge, which I really didn't talk about in this presentation. We were in there a couple of times, I think, but definitely that run, and it was wonderful. And it was all because I taught the superintendent's daughter, Roger Gadd's daughter, trainmaster. Roger Gadd, I said, does your dad work for the railway? Knowing that he did. And she said, yeah. I said, can I get a ride on the train? And she said, well, I'll talk to my dad. Next thing you know, we got a phone call, and yeah, bring your son. And it was great to stand in the cab, and the crew, some of the crew went back into the other locomotives behind, and we had to board the locomotive outside Weyerhaeuser property. So we drove off into the bush. We were driven by the CN car and got on, and it was a wonderful ride. Designed in London, built in London, Ontario by GMD1, and they were built for light rail.
Canadian only.
Canadian only. And you, in this museum, have this bell. This is Jack Hicks's bell. We're very close to the end of my presentation. And it's the second bell that he had. The first bell was cracked. And I need to check the bell because I have the paperwork that he tried to get a bell from the St. Louis,
I can't read your mind.
the St. Louis, what was it called? Sioux Line, from the Sioux Line, and from a private American collector, and it arrived cracked, so that he brought in another one. And it was originally given to Klein Inheritance, and the deal was that Klein didn't want it, I was to get it. But that's okay, it was given by the family to the museum, that's okay, because where would I put this? But I have one thing to say to you. One thing that Jack said, so museum people, Jack said he wanted Klein or myself to ring the bell and say his name. So I think that needs to be a sign in our museum here. Ring the bell and at least remember J.V. Hicks. And we're going to see a locomotive. I'm moving very quickly here. So now this is 5080. This is Harold Collins and his son Randy and Cindy. Cindy's older than Randy, but I have a son and daughter, and I have this up on my wall, my train room, and Harold looked at it and said, that's me. So it's actually autographed too, because I think it's kind of cool. 5080, I'm going to tell you one thing about 5080. Whoops. One thing about 5080. It's very sad. Tom, I think you mentioned this to me in Superstore one day, that the city has donated this to what company?
Aspen Crossing.
Which I think is great to have it rebuilt. But I think all the names of the aldermen and whatever went along with that. And I think it should have been the railway employees. Tom, you had mentioned that. The railway employees, at least in recognition of the work that CN did to run these locomotives and to service these locomotives here in Prince Albert. So I look forward to riding on behind the locomotive, but I think it's a true tribute. It was given by the railway and the employees to the city, to the fairgrounds, and I think we need to have that recognition. And finally, I'm sorry if I've gone a little bit over, Mark. There's a little guy in the cab there. That's Mark. And as Mark will tell you, one of the great things is you have a little boy wearing an engineer's cap. Trains stop. We were out in Little Red taking some pictures. took some pictures, and then suddenly I heard the brakes be applied. I said, Mark, we better get out of here. We weren't doing anything wrong. The train backed up, and the engineer said, did you take my picture? I thought, oh, great. Yeah, I did. Can I have a copy of it? And so the other interesting thing is that by having a son with his engineer's cap on, opens doors for you. Suddenly they would stop what they're doing and come over and talk. And one guy on a track gang, adjusted Mark's cap. That is my half of the presentation, Mark. I'm sorry if I've gone over. Well, that's okay.
David, just wanted to mention that when Aspen got 5080, they said they would put up a sign at their depot and
Yes.
in recognition of it being from PA.
Thank you. Good to hear. Good to hear that. Because the man that worked on that need, well, not by name, but certainly the railway itself. Thank you.
And David, it was actually Marshall Albright who brought that train to PA, and the city paid $1 for it.
Excellent. Thank you.
The old retired train guys used to go there every year and paint it. at the fairground.
Interesting.
Yeah, and clean it up and stuff.
Yeah. And that's wonderful to hear. Then of course, unfortunately, with the asbestos and whatnot, it had to be, but at least they didn't scrap it. But thank you for that.
All right, good.
Flashlights with great.
So I don't know, do I have the ability to press play on there?
You know what? If you want me to do it, I will do it.
Yeah, just press play on there, we're good to go.
Why don't you press?
Awesome.
Okay.
So I'm presenting primarily on Carleton Trail Railway, mostly because that is what I've spent most of my time photographing. The first few images are actually photographs that my father took in the early 90s. So most of these images are of a variety of locomotives, and one of the reasons why is because when Carleton Trail first started on, I think it was December 8th, 1997, the parent company Omni Tracks, which was a company in the United States, had been basically a real estate company, and they purchased some land that had some track on it, and they decided, let's turn it into a railway business. They're not a well-run business, and one of the things that they did was they bought a number of very, very old vintage locomotives, mostly built in the 1950s, that have just been bagged to hell. Some of them had been upgraded in the 1970s, but they needed significant work. And so one of the benefits of growing up here was we had a menagerie of different types of locomotives operating here because of that. Locomotives and equipment you would never see anywhere else together in that form. So as you can see, locomotives from the British Columbia Railway, Hudson Bay Railway, which was the sister railway to Carleton Trail, also previously owned by Omni Tracks. But it also became kind of a mecca for a lot of rail fans, to the point where actually I was out for supper with a bunch of guys back in April in Calgary, and they're talking about their adventures following Carleton Trail through the late 90s, early 2000s. And so it really was something that brought people here to photograph. But through the 90s, a lot of people in Prince Albert were no longer connected to the railway. So I always talk about when either I'm showing images, I'm photographing trains, I do a lot of traveling where I interact with a lot of people. Often I'll be photographing trains and people ask me, what's your interest, why are you here? And then you learn that they have some connection or tie to the railway. And that is one of the most fascinating things, is the railway, built a lot of communities that exist today, and most people you talk to know someone that either works for or previously worked for the railroad. So there's going to be a lot of images. Now we're kind of moving into sort of this would have been probably 2010 for Carleton Trail. So when Carleton Trail first started, I decided I was too cool for trains because I was around 10 years old and decided trains weren't interesting for me anymore. Then as I got older and went into early adulthood, I thought, these are kind of cool and I don't know how long they're going to be around. And so I spent a lot of time documenting the railway. One of the benefits of me actually spending a lot of time documenting the railway is I learned how to take pictures. And so I started with just a simple point-and-shoot camera, and gradually I've built up my camera equipment. And I often joke I could probably get basically a down payment on a house for the amount that I've spent on my photography equipment. But it's been an opportunity, and it's been a great opportunity because not only have I been able to historically showcase the railway, but I've met a lot of people who work for the railway over the last number of years and have had some really amazing conversations with some of the people that have worked for the railway. The unique paint scheme is something that's very, very specific for Carleton Trail. So one of the benefits of having a regional railway operating here was that they wanted to have some kind of brand recognition. So the green and yellow locomotives, of course, based off of our provincial colors, were very specific for here. About 10 of those smaller locomotives were painted in that paint scheme, and then one other locomotive, which was a locomotive built by Montreal Locomotive Works in the 1970s, also bore that scheme. Unfortunately, that locomotive went up in flames. It had a leaked fuel line, and despite the mechanics saying it's not fit for duty, corporate down in Loveland, Colorado, I think it was, said, nope, run the unit. And just outside of Dunholm, I believe it went up in flames. So, but that's one of the other aspects of Carleton Trail was it's not just Prince Albert that they operated in. When they took over in '97, they also took over the line from Dunholm all the way up to Meadow Lake. So with, portions of that line were originally Canadian National, other portions were Canadian Pacific Railway. That section of track operated until about 2009. Due to deferred maintenance, that line was very, very rough, and they had a number of derailments. I think there was a significant one down in Leask, I think it was, in 2008 that I saw. So that line was torn up in 2012. Omnitrax doesn't have a good history of maintaining their rail lines. The Hudson Bay Railway that goes up to Churchill, the Port of Churchill was previously owned by Omnitrax. That line, of course, I think it was around 2018, was sold to a number of First Nations and local communities that formed a consortium that are now rehabbing that line. Omnitrax has also owned a number of other lines. That locomotive right there was previously the Okanagan Valley Railway. They had 3 of those locomotives, I believe, painted in that paint scheme. Those were actually painted in Prince Albert. A local contracting company was hired to paint those locomotives. That company went tits up, I think, in '09. And their power was distributed throughout Omnitrax, with us receiving that locomotive, which was operating there at the time as well. There's also Kettle Falls International Railway, which is another Omnitrax line, and it's in the process of being abandoned. I think they've recently rescinded that abandonment request, but as we can see, Omnitrax has a history of buying up lines and tearing them up. On the flip side though, one of the unique things that's come about these kind of cool photographs of the cars being repaired, one of the flip sides of that is that, so my father mentioned Roger Gadd. Roger Gadd was the train master here with CN. He, I think he retired and then came out of retirement to work as the general manager for Carleton Trail for a number of years. And I know there's a Carleton Trail former employee in here, so if I make any mistakes, let me know. I'm basing most of this on oral narrative because there isn't a lot of actual documentation available to depict the history of our railways. But around the early 2000s, Roger Gadd was able to secure funding to rehab the roundhouse. And so in the 90s, a part of the roundhouse was being used by a local lumber company for storage. But beyond that, it was largely abandoned. And I remember walking through and there were literally probably piles this high of pigeon crap. That's how derelict the building was. And so Carleton Trail needed Operations Center to do the repair work on their locomotives because unlike CN or CP, there was no centralized location for repair work. So a lot of the repair work had to be done here. So what we're seeing right here is a traction motor changeout. So the trucks or the wheels of the locomotive, all 4 of those are powered. And so when the locomotive is operating, the engine's producing power or energy for those motors to run, and then those motors would turn. So when they wear out, they have to lift the locomotive up and actually physically remove them. In much larger, David?
Mark, so how are those traction motors powered?
Do you want to do the description?
No, I'm going to ask the question because a lot of people think it's a diesel, so it's going to be driven like a diesel truck.
Yes, and that's the biggest difference, right? So in our vehicles, our motor actually runs our wheels. The motor is a power plant for the locomotive. And so the motor connects to an alternator which produces electricity. I believe the alternator is in the tail end there, and the electricity then runs those traction motors. So one of the benefits of, with my father, taking me down to the rail yards over the years is I just decided, well, I'll start showing up, and if they tell me to get the hell out, I'll leave. But if not, we'll see what happens. And so one of the benefits was that traction motor changeout was something that I was invited to. I had the opportunity. Their head mechanic and I had been talking about getting some photographs of that. So I was able to photograph that then, and then back in 2015 I also photographed the same locomotive receiving that work being done. So I have tons of photographs, and these might start to get a bit redundant, but I wanted to, again, to get as many photographs of Carleton Trail as possible, really to depict just the uniqueness of some of these locomotives and the history that they have for Prince Albert. And so Carleton Trail, when they first took over in '97, had great ambitions. Of course, the pulp mill was still operating at the time. White Star Terminal was a big supplier as well for the railway. Of course, as we know, in 2006, the pulp mill closed down, and there was a lot of fear what that was going to do economically for Prince Albert, but it also had a significant impact on the railway. I don't know in terms of tonnage or percentage of traffic, but a large percentage of that traffic was coming through the pulp mill. And so right now, these are pictures I've sort of highlighted some different themes. These pictures are what I call the decline years of Carleton Trail. So these were the years where there's a controlled burn being done. These were the years where the railway was just sort of existing. Most of their money was being made either in servicing White Star Terminal or storing rail cars. So you'll often see tank cars or other types of cars just sitting on train tracks, and you might see 20 or 30 of them there. Those are sitting in storage. The rail storage industry is big business. As we know, there are a lot of rail cars, and when there's downturns in the economy, they need to go somewhere. Large railways don't like them sitting in their yards because they get in the way. So if we've got a few extra branch lines kicking around that aren't being used, we can shove those cars onto those tracks. The downside is, and actually I don't think I have any photos on here, but once in a while a plow wind will come through, and the way rail cars are designed, the cars just sort of balance on the wheel, so if a wind comes through, they'll just take the car right off and the wheel just stay right on the tracks. And so if everybody remembers that big power outage, I think it was around 2012, 2015, somewhere in there, a plow wind had gone through and knocked out the main transmission lines for PA, and also knocked out a ton of hopper cars that were in storage, just flipped them right off. So the Carleton Trail in 2001 also purchased the section of track from Prince Albert to Birch Hills. The intention at that time was to expand the railway. Carleton Trail actually operated out of Arborfield, Saskatchewan for a period of time. So between Crooked River and Arborfield, there's a small spur line that operates there. There's an alfalfa dehydration plant in Arborfield, and Carleton Trail serviced that as well. Around 2005, it was no longer viable to have that section of track operating because of the distance from the main shops in Prince Albert, and so that line was closed and actually sold to the community of Arborfield, who continue to operate that line there. A number of the photographs that are going to be taken here, or they're shown here, are from 2012. In 2012, the railway contracted J&L Consulting out of BC to come in and scrap the locomotives that were no longer operational. 3372 is the blue locomotive there. That bell down there is off of that locomotive, and one of the number boards is off of that locomotive. So I was working my bachelor's degree at the time and had some extra spare time. So I just hung out and photographed these guys taking these things apart. And I talked to one of the guys and I said, I want the bell. And he said, okay. Took his acetylene torch, sliced it right off, and now it's in my basement. So, but again, it's the right time, the right place. That bell would have probably gone to some collector in the States. I wanted it because of the historical significance that ties it to the city of Prince Albert. So again, these boxcars were all lined up there. I think these actually might have been boxcars that would have been damaged on the Meadow Lake line. They brought them in here and they were beyond repair, so they scrapped them as well. It gives an opportunity to see what the locomotive looks like inside as well. So they stripped off all the doors and they eventually just slowly took it apart piece by piece. And you'll see in a moment too what it looks like when the prime mover, or the motor, or the engine is being taken out of the locomotive. But as I had said earlier, a lot of these locomotives were built around 1955. They were rehabbed around 73 to 76. And then in 1997, rehabbed by Omnitrax. I'm not sure exactly what they did to rehabilitate them, but these locomotives were in rough shape when they came here to Prince Albert. Yes.
They were originally GP10s, correct?
They are GP10s, originally GP9s. Illinois Central Gulf rebuilt them. So, going back to just briefly in terms of the rail line abandonment, the Meadow Lake line likely wouldn't have been abandoned if it wasn't for CN. So, in 1993, in anticipation of privatization, because CN at that time was still owned by the federal government, they had to go through and look at a number of grain-dependent branch lines that had become redundant and were no longer revenue generating. And so during a game of golf, and this is what it was told to me, so Roger Gadd, again, train master, after he retired from Carleton Trail, he went down south to Shaunavon to work for Great Western Railway. I spent a countless number of hours going down there and actually just sitting with him, getting as much of the oral history of Carleton Trail as I could. And one of the stories is he was out playing golf with one of the superintendents, and the guy said, "We're going to make Prince Albert an island. We will destroy the city of Prince Albert's rail service. We will make sure that they will no longer be viable." Their intent was that they wanted to continue to operate at the mill. They wanted to strip everything else out. So in the 90s, I grew up basically going down and watching the trains operate daily. Up until 1991, Canadian Pacific and CN were operating regularly through the yards. After that, it was primarily CN, but they were still running a number of daily trains. There was a train actually that would come out from Hudson Bay. It would come into Prince Albert. They would haul actually aluminum hopper cars that were designed to go up to the Port of Churchill, and box cars. We were actually one of the last places in North America that still operated box cars for grain revenue service. That line slowly trickled down, but the line between Prince Albert and Shellbrook was light rail. So light rail being 60 pounds of rail for, I think, was it 50 feet or so. What is it? 60 pound per
39 foot.
39
Per
foot.
yard.
Yeah, there we go.
60 pounds per yard.
Per yard, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So that rail line was severed, and that was actually probably basically it could have been an artery to Meadow Lake. Had that happened, we know the Meadow Lake mill is still open, they would have been hauling traffic through into Prince Albert. They took that out. The line up to Henryburg was also removed around 93 as well. And so for most of my time when I was really seriously photographing Carleton Trail, their only revenue service was pretty much the grain elevator out at White Star and what we would call transload sites. So what would happen is contractors would contact the railway, they would have like one car to service. SAS Power is a good example of that. There's actually a spur just outside Little Red, and that's called the SAS Power siding, and that was specifically used for SAS Power power pools. I think that track actually dates back to 1912 or something like that. It's really, really old light rail. There's also, you'll see actually if you drive through going up on 6th Avenue, you'll see these large white tanks in the yard. Tiger Calcium, which is a calcium chloride company, built those around this time as well. Calcium chloride is a chemical that's used as a dust suppressant, and they would spray it onto the grid roads. And so there were a number of contracts for a lot of the lake country areas that operated that. This is another example of being able to be in during the action. So these were some mechanics, they were brought in from the Hudson Bay Railway, so they were operating in the PAW. And they happened to be working on this locomotive when I was down in the area, so I got to spend some time just watching them kind of do some of that work. One of the things that I like about the railway is there's that human connection to it. So a lot of my photographs have images of the people that worked on the railway or continue to work on the railway, because they are the ones that operate these machines. They are the ones that sacrifice their time, their families to do this type of work. Hours and hours go into being a railroader, and anyone who has been a railroader in here recognizes that. You can spend a lot of time away from your family. It's hard, it can be dirty work, it can be boring work at times as well when you're just running along, a light branch line doing 5 miles per hour. And so the people of the railway are so important. They are the ones that operate these, they repair them, and so that is a piece of it that I really wanted to take in as well. So this is an example of what we would call a transload service. So this would be, I think, Co-op fertilizer. Often will get their fertilizer shipments in the spring, and so you'll see once in a while there's a track that goes out by the roundhouse, and you'll see once in a while a few cars sitting on that. For a while, one of the companies in PA that operates for steel manufacturing was hauling in large loads of steel through the railway as well. But again, the main servicing for the railway, or the main services that the railway provides, is car storage, and then of course the White Star Inland Terminal. For a brief period of time, Carrier Lumber was also loading lumber up. So there's the lumber yard that's just outside, just west of the pulp mill. I haven't seen anything there for a number of years, but that is another example of some of the services that they provide. So these locomotives, I think, have about 1,700 horsepower or so. The power these locomotives have is not enough to actually haul a grain train up the hill in Prince Albert. So despite the fact that people talk about Saskatchewan being very flat, there is a significant grade that the locomotives have to go up out by the penitentiary. And it is so heavy, they have stalled out, and I've watched them stall out on there before. And they're coming up, and they're coming up, and then they stop, and then they back up, and then they come back up again. As a kid, growing up, so we, when we used to follow the train, we'd go out by Westmore and sort of that area. The train would come through usually about 3 or 4 3,000 horsepower locomotives, and then right at the end, these two little switchers would be helping as pusher units going back up. But do you want to tell the story about
Yes, so what happened was, we shot the train, it was so cool. And then hey, there's the helper unit, and the helper unit's pushing the train up. And I said to Mark, this is kind of cool, let's walk up the track, it's gone. So we're walking up the track, going up the hill, and then I suddenly thought, okay.
Bit of a Stand By Me moment.
You know, stand by, something's coming. And they were coasting down the track. So they were just slowly coming down the grade. And I said, we gotta get off the track now! And so we jumped up. So if that had happened, if we'd been impacted, we wouldn't be here today. Stay off the track.
Actually, there's video I have because my father took a lot of VHS video, and over the last few years I've been digitizing some of it. And there is some video of Carlton Trail going up the hill. You see the helper units coming in the back, and then it just stops. And the whole train backs right back into PA Yard, and then has to go back out again. So it is an incredible grade. How many cars could those units pull? I'm asking you now.
Those little guys?
Yeah.
I don't know, 125 cars?
Yeah, I think that was about it. So
maybe going with 100 cars.
Yeah.
And well, now they got bigger ones.
Yeah, the heavier power. Again, right place, right time. I got some nice pictures there of the car accident, because of course people try to blow through and beat the train. Again, some really good, just cleaning up the carbon in there as well. So what Carlton Trail will do is, because the grain elevator requires a set amount of cars, usually about 100 cars, they would pull those cars into the yard, and then they would take them in cuts of 25 to 15 cars, and Plouston and McDowell have sidings. They would bring the cars in, park them on the sidings, and then leave them, come back into PA, and then the next day they would just pick them up along their way. They still do that even though they have heavier power now operating some of these trains. 1006 now is actually owned by a family in southern Saskatchewan. They recently purchased it. It is non-operational. I can't remember specifically why it's non-operational. It was the last Carlton Trail locomotive to operate on our rail lines, and it was about a month and a half ago that they purchased it. So it's a group of people that purchased vintage locomotives, and of course these are now antiques. So they picked them up. 1004, I believe, had an alternator fire, and the whole back end got burned up, and then it was sold to a scrapping company. So another example of a traction motor changeout on here, just how far they pull it up. So the large crane lifts the locomotive up, and then another crane comes in and drops the traction motor onto almost like little sets of skis, and then they slide it under the locomotive, line it up just right, and then lower the locomotive back down onto it.
So those trains that they take in sections, where are they going?
When they just take them in the small sections?
Yes,
They
they
take
get them all together again, and they go where? They
So
don't have any other gradients that are as bad as that?
that's the worst for PA. So once they've got them hooked up, it's pretty flat from basically from Plouston to Saskatoon. The land is fairly flat, and so they have a lot less difficulty pulling from there as well. Some of the other customers on the line earlier, you saw Duck Lake. Bell Pulses operates out of Duck Lake. Pulse crops are hauled typically by container, but any feed that's from the pulses, any of the waste, will be hauled out by hopper cars. So they've occasionally serviced the elevator there, and I'm not sure if it's still being done, but in Hague, Potash Corp or Nutrien now, I believe, one of their car repair companies was based out of Hague as well. So railways look for any way to generate traffic, And there are a lot of old rail sidings on Carlton Trail and many other rail lines that aren't being used. Those were previously grain elevator sidings, and so they will find anything they can, whether it's storage or otherwise, to gain some revenue from. When Carlton Trail first took over, there were still a number of wooden elevators that were still being serviced. Rostern had a handful. That's my stepson right there. He's 15 now. I asked him if he wanted to come today. He decided he wanted to shoot zombies on Call of Duty instead of coming. But so a number of the wooden elevators were still operating when Carlton Trail took over, but they were very much in their swan song. And so now the only elevator that's operated is the Viterra elevator, which I believe in 2016 received massive upgrades. And so hence why we have some of the heavier powers. So this locomotive was only with us for a short period of time. That's a GP40, had about 3,000 horsepower. It would have been built in the early 70s. So Hudson Bay Railway would give us the junk that they didn't want, and there were major issues, I think, with that locomotive when it first came over, so it needed some rehabbing work before it started working actively on the rail line here. Going back to my stepson there, all our summer holidays are planned around trains and hiking. So I love to hike in the mountains, and I love to photograph trains, and my wife is just kosher with me planning our trips around those areas because she loves being in the mountains herself. And there is one thing that is quite spectacular when you look at how long the trains are. When you're standing at the peak of a mountain, you watch one of those trains come through there, over 100 cars, and it looks minuscule, but yet it's also quite daunting to see just how long it takes up. So, of course, railways operate in any kind of weather, any time of day as well. So whenever I would hear the horn, I'd grab my camera and I'd head down and try and follow them. I haven't had as much opportunity to follow them. Now I have 3 kids, I have a job, I have a business, so I have a lot going on, so I don't get out as much. But hence why, when I was making this slideshow, I wanted to have as many photographs of the history of the railway as possible as well, because of how much has changed. On the table over there too, so I'm a model railroader as well. I'm one of the few people that actually models Carlton Trail. You can now buy Carlton Trail locomotives in this is HO scale. However, all the ones I built, I had to scratch build, and I actually had to make the decals myself. So I had to go to a printing company in Prince Albert, and they printed those onto printed the logo onto the decal sheets so I could build it. But one of the reasons why I brought my models here today was also to showcase that menagerie of locomotives that operated on this rail line as well. It was always quite a rainbow of different locomotives, and very, very unique locomotives. So the model that I have there was a picture earlier. Only 8 of those locomotives were ever built, and one of them operated in Prince Albert for a period of time as well. These are photographs. So this is as Carlton Trail started to evolve in the mid 2010s. They started requiring some heavier power, because as I had said, they were rehabbing the elevator and they needed locomotives that could haul more. This was the night that the first 2 replacement units came in. So 2 of these are actually still operating on the rail line. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time as I photographed them going in. The cool aspect of it though is they're using the roundhouse, and just how important the roundhouse is for the operations of the rail service. So now we move into kind of that present form of the railway. I also encourage people, and I was going to say this before I started as well, feel free to jump in. I do a lot of presentations for my work, and so my presentations often involve me just, basically taking, hey, give me the camera. Involve me doing a back and forth. So please, if you have questions as we go through here, let me know. But as I started getting more experience in my photography too, I wanted to start taking more astro or night photography. And so there's some really interesting looks that it can provide, especially in black and white, of the railway. But just images like this are very, very significant and historic. So as we talked about, this was the last roundhouse built, but it's also one of the few roundhouses that's actually still being used. So in the lead up to this presentation, I was doing a little bit of sleuthing online and found an Excel document dating back to 2013 of all the extant roundhouses, roundhouse foundations, turntables and turntable pits, I think it was North America. At that time, there were about 13-ish or so that still had, or 13 roundhouse turntable combinations that still existed. Not all of them in operation. There's now 4. So our turntable and roundhouse are one of 4 in Canada that are still being operated by a revenue generating railway. And so that's that significance there. Earlier in here too, there were some pictures of the roundhouse pit, and you saw a bunch of guys with brooms. Of course, in the winter, there's so the roundhouse or the turntable has a piece of track that goes around in a circle, and on that track there are wheels that move the turntable. In the winter, a lot of ice buildup. It's really difficult to move those things, and when it's 40 below, as I'm sure you can probably attest, it's not a lot of fun. So, and there were times that I would spend down there photographing, watching for 20 minutes and trying to get one locomotive turned on that turntable. And so after a long day, bringing a train in from Saskatoon, the last thing you want to do is spend that extra time having to move it on that turntable. But again, it speaks to the human effort that goes into these railways as well and how significant they are. And so we are seeing again a lot of these newer locomotives. These are rental locomotives, so the railway no longer actually owns the locomotives that they operate. It's actually cheaper as a rental. There's a picture of my stepson getting water. One of the traditions that I've actually had with railways is railway water. Back in the day, CN used to have these little cups about this big, and they were plastic cups, and I think they had like a paper top. And every time that I rode the train, an engineer or conductor would give me one of those. And so there was a special moment when my stepson got that water, and I think it was you that gave him the water too. So, just those opportunities are always important, and it builds that connection and the relationship with the railway workers as well. As a railway photographer, I know a lot of individuals that work for the railway or have worked for the railway, various railways across Canada. And so it gives you lots of opportunities to hear some of those stories and to hear the complexities of rail. I will probably never work for the railroad. It is not something that would be my skill set, but it's something that I love watching the iron horses moving, and I have nothing but the utmost respect for the guys and the women that operate some of these trains. And just how, for me, beautiful these things are operating on these lines. And so spending so many hours photographing and building those connections with the railway crew. So this is them actually dropping a cut of cars. Actually, I think they're picking up cars in Clouston. So they're cutting the train off, they're going to bring it up, and then they'll load up the cars on the siding. Clouston used to be a place I'd go to photograph the train a lot. And there was one time I used to drive a little Honda Civic, and I got that thing stuck really badly. And the crew got out and pushed me out. So I think I owe them a beer for that one. But again, just the countless hours that I spend. My wife probably gets annoyed with me because there's times I hear the train and I take off, and she knows I probably won't be back. So I usually get the order that I have to be back within 15-20 minutes, which means I can't follow them all the way to the roster like I used to be. So. Any questions from people? We're at the point now. Yeah.
Okay, we often see the graffiti on the where do they do that when the cars are sitting waiting?
When they're parked. And so graffiti is often a message as well. So a lot of graffiti artists use them because it's a rolling canvas. So I don't understand the graffiti, but there are certain styles or messages that that the graffiti artists use to communicate with other artists all over North America. Rail cars in PA could end up in Mexico City. So they could end up anywhere. Most of the grain, I'm not sure where most of our grain goes to. Usually it goes out to Vancouver or Thunder Bay, but occasionally it'll be shipped down south as well. And so there's some message that comes with all that graffiti, but it's usually happening when they're parked in a rail yard somewhere.
So what do the train companies think? Do they, because it actually it's quite pretty when you're watching the trains go by.
Well, I think the biggest concern that they have is if it covers up critical information. So every rail car has detailed information on the side. Its carrying weight, its empty weight, the date year it was built, the last time it had any maintenance done. Legally, that stuff has to be presented on there. So you'll actually often see graffiti artists will paint around those things because they know that if they don't, it's just going to be covered up by the railway itself.
Do you think the railway, Carl Trail, do you think they make any money storing, is that a lucrative thing?
That is a lucrative thing. So Roger Gadd took credit for it. I don't know if he was actually the one that got them starting to store cars, but I can't remember. I think it's like 25 cents a day or something for cars. So for a while they were storing them on every siding they could. They had them all the way out to the mill. They had them on the Birch Hills line.
Yeah.
So that does generate a lot of revenue. Great Western Railway down south, they have like 800 miles of track. They store a lot of cars. There's a section from, I can't remember what the town is, but basically all the way up to Swift Current is just car storage. And they'll store for Canpotex and other companies.
We see cars along the road to Melford. Are those?
So yeah, along the road to Melford, there's often storage there. So Northern Lights Rail owns the rail line now from Birch Hills to Melford, and they store basically for after Canistino, it's all closed. There's no customers, so they store all the cars on there. So if you see cars lined up there, that's usually
And there's always cars lined up.
there. Yeah.
What do you know about the rail line? Is it from Hudson Bay Junction to Churchill?
Yes.
Have they redone that road?
So that line is undergoing significant work. So Arctic Gateway is the company that now owns it. It's a consortium of indigenous communities and other communities along the rail line. AGT was a company that they partnered with initially. It is now actually community owned, and they're putting billions of dollars into that line as well. So I follow them on social media, and they give a lot of updates in terms of that work. And because of the muskeg up that way, that line needs continuous maintenance as well.
So is it being used right now?
It is being used, yeah. So in the winter, I don't know how much traffic they get up that way. That line actually is one of the last places in North America where they still ship freight the way they used to. So you'll see, trailers sitting on cars, box cars with supplies. And when I was up in Churchill in 2019, I watched that train come in, and it looks like something of the 1960s. You've got these old vintage rail cars. You've got rail cars that actually transport vehicles in them, and not those modern ones that we see. These are these really old beat-up box cars. So they'll haul up there during the grain season, which is really short up there. I think they start hauling around May. They'll haul grain up to the Port of Churchill. They're also experimenting with things like potash and other stuff as well.
So how much of all this stuff is American owned?
This railway is American owned, and I believe it is. I could be incorrect, but I think it's the only American owned railway in Saskatchewan right now. Yes.
I was just going to say, you mentioned about the economy. You can tell how the economy is doing in terms of what commodities are having cars stored. So, for example, in Prince Albert, you'll suddenly see a number of coal hoppers. We're not hauling coal here; they're storing the cars here, or fuel cars for the oil patch, or chemical tank cars. And it's interesting because there'll be a whole cut of cars, and they're just being stored here. They're not actually being operated.
So this is actually the last image of my slideshow. So that wraps up my portion. David.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. The last thing I'd like to say. The last thing I'd like to say is Prince Albert, because of where the railways are located, and primarily CN, it's interesting because you can always hear the trains in PA. Always hear the trains in PA.
You still can.
You can, but not as frequent as before. And it used to be I'd hear the train and go, oh my God, I'd grab my camera, grab Mark in his bucket, and on we would go. And there's nothing more exciting than to drive down the 6th Avenue viaduct and they're shunting cars. And I think, oh my God. But then my wife will say, sorry, David, no train pictures today. Anyway, I just wanted to say that we always hear the train here in PA, and I think it's a wonderful thing to celebrate this industry. So, thank you. I know we've gone long. But
When I was a kid growing up in the West Flat,
Yep.
right beside the tracks,
Yep.
my dad worked at the Bird, but he'd come home and he'd say, "We're gonna be switching boxcars tonight."
Yep.
And we would put a fusee on there, it'd be totally dark, and you'd hear this, and then the boxcar going by.
Yeah.
It was pretty exciting.
And things like that draw so much memory. So as a kid, I remember, and I don't think that this is actually allowed by the railway anymore, but they used to use just the cars just would fly down the track. So they would cut the cars, the locomotives would give them enough of a push that they would just kind of coast along, and everyone bang, and they'd smash into another set of cars. And so you don't see that as much anymore. I think it's really, really hard to do couplers.
And I have a car walker, so they would, if you had to position a car in so for example, a box car of grain, you put it underneath the wheel and you pull up and you can actually walk the car. I have one.
Car jack.
Car jack. Yeah, and it's so cool.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mark,
Yeah.
your dad just mentioned your mom.
Mhm.
Would you give a big thank you to her for putting up with you and David as you preserve this massive history.
I will most definitely.